The last time I made a video about the Gameboy Pocket, I talked about how most of us in the modding community only seem to value it for its body, sticking a Game Boy Color in there and calling it a day, but not actually paying a lot of attention to the Game Boy Pocket itself. And I am quite guilty of that as well, because after I installed the screen in that video, I didn't really use the Game Boy Pocket anymore. In fact, I took that display and I put it in a Game Boy Light. But I'm your cool Uncle Marissa, and I might have just turned a page thanks to the newest laminated display for the Game Boy Pocket. This is from Hispeedido, and it is late. There have been so many laminated screens so far for Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and there's so many options, different manufacturers, different screen types. As you all know, probably if you've watched my channel, I love the ITA screen for the Game Boy Advance. Cloud Gaming Store just came out with a new technology display for the Game Boy Color, again, laminated. But the Game Boy Pocket still only had two main options, neither of which were laminated. And one of them had on-screen display, the other didn't, while the one that didn't have on-screen display was able to use the contrast wheel, which was fun, and that's the one that I had picked. But now we have a laminated display! Will it make a difference? Let's install it and find out. So this display is from Hispeedido, and as you can see on the store page, it does require a cut. I'm going to cut the shell that I already have so we can explore how easy or difficult that is. Huge shout out to the video I always rewatch before cutting a display, this quick and dirty video from yesterday's tech. Check it out if you ever need a really quick refresher on how to cut a shell for a laminated display. But it does come with pre-cut options as well. I don't love the colors, and since the shell I have is opaque, I don't have to worry about, you know, the cuts creating scratches or something like that that will be seen through. If I scratch something or whatever, it's hidden. It's our little secret. But yeah, if you don't want to cut, that is an option. They don't seem to yet just sell the pre-cut shells, but in my experience with Hispeedido, if you ever contact them and ask them to sell you something separately, they do so gladly. They just make you a listing and you can buy it. This laminated display also has OSD, and it has the interlaced and pixel and just clean grids that they have in their Game Boy Color OSDs as well. And you have a lot of control over the palette colors as well, which is very cool. On the product page, they have a couple of settings for more traditional color palettes, and you obviously can also play around and see what works best for you or the game that you're playing in that moment. I feel like this adds another layer of just tinkering to the process of trying to play a game, but in a fun way. Anyway, let's go ahead and install it. So we're going to cut an OEM shell, and then we're going to install it, and we're going to test it and also compare it to the previous iteration of this display from Hispeedido, which is the non-laminated Game Boy Pocket screen. Here is the trimmed shell. Because it was already trimmed partially for an IPS screen, and because I over trimmed it, I didn't want to include that video. But the yesterday's tech video that is linked here is super helpful in how to navigate cutting, and I would highly recommend checking your work while cutting, because it didn't need me to remove the entire top and bottom border. I did end up with some gaps, so it's a little tricky. I also recommend, instead of using the included adhesive, to use B7000 glue, because this adhesive did not really last and it popped up, and that is the result of the curved top front shell of the Game Boy Pocket, I believe. So yeah, just some hot tips off the bat. Now, an interesting thing about this one is it needs to be soldered to the vias. Because of this, I'm using this J-tip. You can also help yourself a little bit by using a fiberglass pen, that's the red one over there, to try to scrape off some solder mask so that you have more of an area to work with. Just be gentle and don't accidentally scrub off too much. These are the points which you will need to solder to. I like to start with soldering the wires to the board before soldering them to the Gameboy Pocket board. And the included wires are fine. Sometimes they're not, but generally I feel the included wires with Hispeedido and Cloud Gaming Store are decent. Just heat up that via and put it in. You're able to sort of stick the wire in the hole a little, which will help with it staying. Now I'm going to stick on the included insulation sticker. It's a little wide, so I did have to cut it down. Alternatively, you could just use some Kapton tape, especially if you have thicker ones. My Kapton tape is quite narrow, so that would be quite time consuming. From here, that last wire that's hanging on actually goes on the power button, which is the opposite side of the board. So we can put our buttons in and then put in the board and then solder that last wire. I would also recommend putting some Kapton tape onto the wire solder points and a little above as well, just to keep it from shorting, but also to keep it from being pulled off in case you ever pull it out aggressively because you've forgotten or any such a thing. Now that my cables are managed, I'm actually going to go back and desolder these from the display board and shorten them a little just so they don't get caught on anything. And also a shorter wire is always a better connection. This is absolutely not necessary. This is just me doing my thing. I do actually recommend while you're doing this, before you close it up, to use a multimeter to just make sure there's continuity between the points on the Gameboy Pocket board and the display board, because it's a little tricky sometimes with soldering to vias to kind of check your work visually. This way you can make sure that it's beeping, you've got continuity between each point on each board, and that way you can close it up with a bit more confidence. Once that's set, I will clean it up with some isopropyl alcohol and put some Kapton tape there as well. If you have your own screen, you may notice that on the left and right, those little square footprints are missing the touch sensors. That's because I hate touch sensors, and if you have on-screen display, what is the point of them even? So I desoldered to those as well, and I had cleaned up the solder on the footprints so it's not as bumpy. And then I'm going to cover those with Kapton tape as well. Now we can connect this wire to the power button. We can cut it to size so that it's not long and dangly, and just solder it down with some fresh solder and flux, of course. Don't forget to actually connect the display into the ribbon cable slot, and I am sticking the wire to the power button underneath the ribbon cable so that it doesn't get caught when I put the two sides of the shell together. Some Kapton tape here as well, again to prevent things getting caught and pulled on. Next we can screw down the PCB. I recommend just doing 1 or 2 screws so that it stays in place, so that you're not creating a Sisyphean task of screwing and unscrewing for yourself if you need to troubleshoot. Next I put the back on just to put the batteries in. I don't actually screw it on, and then turn it on. Now usually when you turn on these new screens, you can access the on-screen display immediately. For some reason, with this display kit, you can't access the on-screen display unless you have a game running. And so that made me think that something was broken, but it's not. So don't worry, just make sure you have a game put in, and then you can hit the shortcut, which is select AB to access the on-screen display. It's a little annoying also because you're gonna be putting in inputs to whatever game you have going on or your flash card or whatever. Not the most ideal situation, but that's how it is. Also, whenever I boot this little number 1 comes on the top left, which is funny. But there we go, we can control the brightness, pixel effects, the battery display, which I've never used the battery display. I'm not sure how reliable it is. Brightness, if you want to use the contrast wheel to control it, set it on RW For pixel effect, we have the typical no effect retro pixel interlaced with 2 horizontal and 1 vertical interlaced. It's not super clear on this. I tend to like the interlaced option on these more so than the retro pixel. I've come a long way. And then here we have our color adjust, where you have RGB sliders for all 4 of the colors that create the Game Boy Pocket palette. So this is a lot of fun. Once that is good and everything is working, you just put your 6 screws back in to screw it back up. And I recommend always doing a sort of soft close with the screws before you tighten them up, and also to kind of go from screw to screw so that you're not putting a lot of tension on one corner without matching that tension in the other corners. Now let's go ahead and take a look at comparing this screen with the previous non-laminated IPS version, which came with preset palettes and no minute control over the colors. We are all installed and it is beautiful. It is so gorgeous. It's so crisp. The colors are so vibrant. I don't know, it's a very new experience for a console that I've only ever seen a dimmer version of, or not as crisp of a version, because you know, even the newer IPS screens, like, yeah, they look good, but not having it be laminated, there's that distance and it causes a lack of the same vibrancy that you get with a laminated screen. And it's really gorgeous. I'm really enjoying playing it. Granted, I'm only playing like Tetris, but I wouldn't mind taking Pokemon Yellow for another spin or something like that. You know, I still love the Pocket form factor, and that's why my favorite Game Boy colors are my Game Boy Pocket colors. But I think this really breathes new life into it in a way that I don't think even the older IPS screens did. My wish list kind of thing for this, which it's not gonna happen probably, but the thing that I wish is, I do wish that you could save your palette colors somehow, instead of just having to overwrite every time. That would be pretty neat. If I were to do this again, I would definitely recommend you, and also I guess past me, to check the screen fit as you go while you're cutting, because as we saw, I cut a lot more than was necessary. And I think that's really easy to do because it seems like it's just slightly smaller than doing a full cut on the top and bottom. So you might need to leave a little bit of clearance. It's not aesthetically a problem, I think, again, because this isn't a clear shell, so when it's all closed up, we could see that we don't really see the gaps. Speaking of, I did actually end up having the screen pop off after I did it. It doesn't fall out, but you can see the gaps. You can see it's lifting, especially on one side. And I think that's a quirk of just the shape of the Game Boy Pocket, because if you have one near you and you grab it right now, you'll notice this is something that caught me off guard when I first got my Game Boy Pocket Color, is that the front where it says Nintendo is kind of bloated, raised, rounded. I'm not really sure why, to be honest, but I think this might be part of the reason that the screen on this side popped off. And funny enough, it's actually happened to my laminated Game Boy Pocket Color as well. And that one's not so much an easy fix because that one is like a special order from this guy on Taobao who just, he takes the screen, the front shell, and the lens and just UV glues them together. So I don't really have the clearance to go in and put some glue in, unfortunately. So c'est la vie. But with this one, I opened it up, I took the screen back out, and I used B700 B7000 glue, and I put it on the sides. Be very careful with it. Don't use too much because otherwise when you put the lens on, it'll squeeze out onto the sides, and then you have to deal with cleaning that. It's not super difficult to clean, but it's just an added chore. Another piece of advice is definitely grab some of that glue and use that so it doesn't pop off. It's been, I would say, maybe a week or two, maybe a week, I think a week that I've used the glue on it, and it has stayed flat. So fingers crossed there won't be any problems moving forward. And here is another wish of mine that could happen. So I know I said that seeing the Game Boy Pocket for its own merits is something that I am probably going to do with this display. However, I don't think it hurts to see it for its form a little bit more. Continue to do that. So I would be very, very interested and excited to see if this screen could be used for a Game Boy Pocket Color. And the reason I say this is because, like I said, the laminated option, the only one there is to get someone to sandwich the display, the front, and the lens together for you. And that's not something that's easy to do yourself. You need like stuff to keep it together, and you need the UV glue and the UV station, and it's very easy to create issues. Not something that I even really wanted to try. So it would be really, really amazing if we could use this on the Game Boy Pocket Color. And someone was mentioning to me that they heard that Hispeedido told them that they're probably going to make a Game Boy Color version of this display, which means there would be a Game Boy Color driver board that you could pair with it, so that essentially we're doing what we do when we put the Q5 screen into the Game Boy Pocket Color, is pairing a Game Boy Color driver board, that's like the brains, with the Game Boy Pocket display, which is quite literally just the display. And so that's how you get those two to work together. You can't have a Game Boy Pocket driver board on a Game Boy Color board that you've put in a Game Boy Pocket, if that makes sense. So if that's true, that is wonderful news. However, with the caveat that the main reason the Q5 screen works is because you are able to move it around. You can move the display around, and that's why you can get it to fit the location of the Game Boy Pocket cutout. Otherwise, if you've ever made a Game Boy Pocket Color, when you turn it on by default, usually it's quite low. However, if they do a Game Boy Color screen with this display and it's laminated, it's possible that it won't have that option, because for a laminated screen, you don't really need to be able to position it because it's stuck to the lens. So it doesn't matter if your lens is, you're not gonna have a lens that's wonky or off center that you need to adjust for. So there's that. And of course, then there's the option of someone much cleverer than me reverse engineering it, in which case the only issue right now is that more and more these manufacturers have started covering up the backs of the displays so that you can't tell what the part is. You don't know where the display came from. So I'm sure if that's figured out, someone could reverse engineer a driver board for it that has the position options. But yeah, this is all in the future. It's all speculation. It's all beyond me personally, but I am very excited if someone is able to do that, because I would love to be able to install a laminated screen in my Game Boy Pocket Colors, especially now that the one that is laminated is lifting. Another thing that I would love is if Hispeedido came out with a version of this with a Game Boy Light lens on it, because as you can see, my Game Boy Light has a Game Boy Pocket / Game Boy Light IPS screen, which is the old version. And I would love to have a laminated screen on that. I think that would be gorgeous, but it just feels wrong to put in a laminated screen that says Game Boy Pocket on it into a Game Boy Light. Fun story about that Game Boy Light that you saw, that is the Tezuka version, which is why it has Astro Boy and Kimba and etc. on it. And I initially had turned it into a Game Boy Light color. Unfortunately, the screen was just getting too much pressure on it because it needed me to cut more of the shell out than I was willing. If I kept cutting, I would end up damaging the artwork or just causing a lot of issues underneath that you can see in a transparent shell. So that's why I ended up just going ahead and sticking in the Game Boy Pocket screen. You might have noticed that it's a little off center. That's because of the cutting I did to fit the Q5 Game Boy Color screen into it. But you know, again, that wasn't enough. So I think it would be a perfect candidate for a Game Boy Light lens laminated display. So I hope they make that. But otherwise, yeah, this is a beautiful screen. It has me not just excited for the possibilities of the future use of this display and this laminated kit, but also it has me pretty excited for what it is already. And I'm glad that it finally got its laminated due. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. Let me know in the comments if you're gonna grab one of these laminated screens or if you have a different preference. I know a lot of people also just prefer the OEM screen for Game Boy Pocket and DMG. Speaking of OEM screen, I know at least one person probably gonna yell at me and be like, you should have kept your original Game Boy Light screen in. No, the reason I was able to get it for an affordable price is because it was damaged. The screen was shot. No. So yeah, there was no OEM screen really to use. Whew. Currently scrolling by are the wonderful names of my wonderful Ko-fi supporters. If you would like to see game reviews and other write-ups, things that I don't necessarily make into videos, please check out my Ko-fi. Speaking of things that I won't be putting in videos, I am starting to live stream on Twitch to fundraise to cover my cat's ER bills. He was hospitalized for 3 nights and thankfully he is all right now. He's on the way up and up, but it's about $15,000 in debt now. So if you want to join, if you want to donate, if you don't want to watch the stream, you can donate directly to the GoFundMe. Both the links to the GoFundMe and my Twitch channel are in the description. There will be a schedule. The things that I am planning to do is play video games, mod things live, and also just have conversations and talk about stuff and give you guys a space to ask questions. And those will be structured. You'll know the topic beforehand. I'll definitely be scheduling things both for my sanity and for your anticipation. So thank you so much in advance if you choose to donate or to join the streams. Please be patient with me. I've never streamed before. And part of that is I'm always like, it feels like you're a zoo animal. So I'm definitely gonna have a very strong two-way communication during these streams. I really want to talk to you guys. I don't want to just be stared at. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget that you are always welcome at Cool Uncle's house, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.